If I could get everybody's attention, I want to thank everybody for coming today, and thank all of you who are out there who've joined us online as well. For some of you who I see here in the room, this is an update. I should say I'm Ralph Blackman. I'm President and CEO of the Century Council. And about 3 years ago at this time, we brought Dr. Schaefer and Dr. Nelson into Washington, D.C. to talk about an initiative that we were going to begin. And 3 years later, we're bringing you here, not to say we're finished, but to bring everybody up to speed on something that we think is very exciting. And we think hopefully over time will have a more than positive impact on DUIs, especially among those offenders who suffer from a variety of issues, including alcohol, but not only limited to alcohol. And so thank you again all for coming here today, and also those of you who are able to join online. Ultimately, our goal is not just the development of an assessment tool to really get at the issues that affect hardcore drunk driving offenders, but ultimately to get that tool out and to get that tool in use so that whether you're in the largest, most sophisticated court or treatment setting, or if you're in a small and you may feel isolated facility out around the country, you have access to what we believe will be the best assessment and most comprehensive assessment that's available. And all of you who are committed to reducing and eliminating drunk driving in this country understand the importance of that. And so thank you very much for joining us, both again here and as well as online. With that, I would just like to quickly introduce Dr. Howard Schaefer, who is the Director of the Division on Addiction and an Associate Professor of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, who spent much of his career looking at the epidemiology of psychiatric comorbidity among multiple DUI offenders, and Dr. Sarah Nelson. And Sarah is the Associate Director for Research at the Division on Addiction and an Assistant Professor of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, who's concentrated much of her research on investigating the psychosocial predictors of repeat DUI offenders. And so with that, Dr. Schaefer.
Thank you, Ralph, and thank you all for coming. Thank you for being here. As Ralph already mentioned, this is really an update. This isn't a final discussion or description of this project. It's a progress report, and we are about 3 years into the project. And 3 years into the project, we have a working version of this particular piece of software that will provide psychiatric assessments, and we're going to demonstrate that. But before we do, I'd like to give you some background. And before I give you some background, I want to share some of our funding sources at the Division on Addiction. And we're obligated to do this. This is to assure everyone involved that we're not in any way influenced by our funders. If you do think there's any bias in anything that Sarah or I say, please let us know. So the objectives for this session are to first introduce you to the Division on Addiction. Some of you may not know who we are. Secondly, we want to briefly overview DUI and repeat DUI, the need for CARS, that's our instrument, a progress report. We're going to demonstrate the instrument for you today, and some of you, because it's only a demonstration, might be interested in seeing more, and you can do that right after the session because we have a working version so you could play with it yourself if you'd like. We're going to talk to you a little bit about our usability trial that we've been conducting. and then some future directions for this project. And finally, you'll all have an opportunity for questions and a roundtable discussion about these issues and issues related to this. So let me begin by just saying that at Harvard Medical School, the Division on Addiction was founded 20 years ago, last year, and our mission is to strengthen worldwide understanding of addiction through innovative research, education, and information exchange. And our ultimate goal, as you might imagine, is to alleviate the burdens, social, medical, and economic, that are caused by addiction. So our goals are broad, our vision is large, and our consideration of addiction, I would say, innovative in many different ways. So what do we mean by addiction? What is addiction? I was with Alan Leshner on a panel here in Washington, D.C. many years ago, and Alan Leshner was then the director of NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse. And Alan asked the question of the audience, when is addiction addiction? And I had never really heard it phrased quite that way, so I made a slide. And here it is. If we were to evaluate the community and identify people through various measures so that we could identify a group that had addiction to drugs, for example, addiction to gambling, addiction to shopping. There are many expressions of addiction. We would identify a group represented by the circle that you see on the screen. However, if we then screened the people who were in the original circle, we would discover that some of them have other disorders. Mania, for one, a hyperactivity disorder. Others would have depression. Others would have personality disorders, such as antisocial personality disorder. And some of these other disorders are exclusionary criteria for addiction. We would not say that these people had addiction. We would say that their addiction was a symptom of these other underlying disorders. Well, to make a long story shorter, we could say there are other unknown disorders that also would erode that original circle of people, that original group of people. And you can see by the image that's on the screen, I've still left room in the center for a group of people that are purely addicted, meaning they don't have any other psychiatric comorbidity, and certainly not psychiatric comorbidity that led to addiction. What we now know, since this slide was originally created many years ago, that many of these other disorders precede or antedate addiction. They are the risk factors that lead to addictive behavior. Now, we also know that for a minority of people, these problems emerge from addiction. So many people with addiction, for example, show up for treatment and they experience depression. Their depression is caused by their experience in relationship to addiction. Other people engage in addictive behaviors because they were depressed. It just so happens that the majority of psychiatric disorders precede addiction and the minority follow. But the relationship among them is considerable. And it is possible, and I know that you were wondering if your Venn diagram experience of middle school was important, but it is now. You'll see that it is possible that an underlying disorder, which we conceptualize at the division as a syndrome, may be responsible for all these expressions. That it may not be any one of these things driving what we see, but it might be something underlying this syndrome disorder, and we do think about addiction as a syndrome. So we need to have perspective in science and in life in general. Sir William Bragg, a Nobel laureate, said the important thing in science is not so much to obtain new facts as to discover new ways of thinking about them. Well, that's exactly what we're doing here. We're beginning to recognize that addiction is driven in many ways by other matters, and those other matters are very important and they're considerable. Now, I couldn't avoid this presentation without bringing you some Boston humor. Stephen Wright, one of our great humorists, he also interprets evidence in a new way. For example, he said not so long ago that he woke up one morning and recognized that all of the things around him had been stolen and replaced by exact duplicates. Stephen sees the world in a very different way. Let's talk about driving and intoxication for a moment. Dave Barry, one of America's great humorists, said, "The one thing that unites all human beings, regardless of age, gender, religion, economic status, or ethnic background, is that deep inside we all believe that we're above average drivers." Now, needless to say, as a scientist, I can assure you that we're not all above average drivers. We can't be. Average suggests some middle-of-the-road consideration, but in many ways we do think we're above average drivers, and that leads in part to road rage and other kinds of problems on the road, because only we're the only ones who are right. When we think about driving, about 20 years after the combustion engine was created, in a journal which I suspect none of you receive, the Quarterly Journal of Inebriety, this was published. There were 25 fatal accidents occurring to automobile wagons. In 19 of these accidents, the drivers had used spirits within an hour of the disaster. Arguably the first documentation of driving under the influence. 76% of these accidents were associated with fatalities. So the mortality rate associated with drinking and driving was considerable. It has come down, and I'll point that out in just a moment, but let's just look at the costs related to DUI. It's the third most common type of crime in the United States, according to the FBI. About 11,000 people have died in a motor vehicle accident with a driver having a blood alcohol concentration over 0.8. Now, we also know that much lower than 0.8 still can cause problems for drivers and for pedestrians alike. So the number of people, the mortality rate associated with driving under the influence is much greater than this. And one person is killed in an automobile crash involving an alcohol-impaired driver every hour, and we can multiply that when we begin to look at alcohol-impaired pedestrians. And finally, a low estimate, I think, of the cost of DUI is about $51 billion a year. And one of the reasons, by the way, for that being an underestimate is that most DUI is never identified. It's a minority of events that are identified. Repeat DUI offenders represent about 1/3 of the DUI arrests. So repeat offense is very important and considerable. If we look at the percent of alcohol fatalities related to automobile accidents, you can see that it's been declining from about 1982 to last year, or 2 years ago. There is a little blip, you can see, a bit of an upturn around the year 2000, but that relates more to an artifact because we redefined acceptable or legal blood alcohol concentrations. None of it is acceptable. You can also see that from a distance, the curve or the trend is flattening out or plateauing in the last 10 or 12 years. There is a slight downturn in the last 2 or 3 years, but overall the trend has plateaued. And that may be because the people who understand the risks and hazards of DUI have heeded the messages, the public education, and they're driving under the influence less or not at all. But there still remain a meaningful percentage of people who are driving under the influence and not heeding any messages. Some of our colleagues in the middle 1980s suggested that focusing on alcohol misuse to the exclusion of attendant behavioral problems, if you will, other psychiatric problems, is quite likely inappropriate for about half of the population of offenders. That was in the 1980s. We now know that it's really not about half, it's probably closer to 70, 75, or maybe even 80%, depending upon how we identify and describe these phenomena. Another group of our colleagues said that treatment programs focusing exclusively on changing alcohol consumption behavior are not likely to reduce accident risk for some of the offender groups. So this isn't just about alcohol. Now, that may be difficult for some people to understand because they think that the object of addiction, and I'm using addiction language now, causes the event. But it isn't just about the object. With every expression of addiction, it's about much more than that. So people who have been convicted of DUI represent a population of people with an extremely high rate of substance use disorders, as you might imagine. So alcohol use disorders, for example, according to our previous diagnostic manual, made up almost all of the people who would be arrested for DUI. But in addition, these arrests are inclusive of people with very high rates of psychopathology, not just substance use disorders. PTSD, for example, major depression, anxiety disorders. These disorders and others can affect the patterns of driving under the influence, can influence alcohol dependence or the emergence of alcohol dependence, can certainly influence the rate of relapse among people using alcohol and other psychoactive substance, because driving under the influence shouldn't be limited just to driving under the influence of alcohol. We have people driving under the influence of prescription drugs. You've all seen, I suspect, prescription drug warnings about operating equipment. There are good reasons for this. They affect our psychoactive activities. So now, to move to the next phase of our demonstration, with that as a very quick, abbreviated, oversimplified background, this was part of the driving force for us to develop the CARS instrument. I want to introduce my colleague, Sarah Nelson, who, as Ralph told you, is the Associate Director at the Division for Research. And as Sarah has dedicated herself to this project in a remarkable way, and I'm very happy to introduce her to you now.
Thank you. Briefly, what I want to do is start where we were 3 years ago. So 3 years ago, we had completed a research project that was really part of the impetus for CARS itself. And what we did is we looked at 800, just under 800 repeat DUI offenders who went through an inpatient program in Massachusetts. And we conducted very comprehensive mental health assessments with those offenders. We used a tool called the Composite International Diagnostic Interview, the CD for short. It's well-validated internationally and a great research tool. It's also 3 to 4.5 hours long per intake to conduct, particularly with this population. So it was a major undertaking by the research team and also by all the counselors and staff at this program. The reason it was so useful is that we could compare our rates to general population national rates. We could compare to the National Comorbidity Survey because the version we used was identical. And what we found, first of all, was not surprising. Drug dependence, drug abuse, alcohol dependence, and alcohol abuse, which the CD defined hierarchically at that time, were extremely elevated in our population of repeat offenders compared to the general population. And these repeat offenders were pretty representative of repeat offenders in Massachusetts. Basically, at that time, you had a choice of going to this inpatient program if you were a repeat offender or doing additional time in jail. So a very large percentage of the repeat population would go through this program. What was not as obvious were the rates we found of psychiatric disorders that were not directly substance-related. So very high rates of lifetime conduct disorder, bipolar disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder for both men and women, and generalized anxiety disorder. Other studies have also found links with major depression. We didn't, which is an interesting finding. But in general, any way we looked at it, the profile of these repeat offenders had very high rates of psychiatric disorder, very high numbers. So kind of the number of disorders each person presented with was higher than the general population. The next question that comes from that is, okay, so they're higher in psychiatric disorders. Does it really relate to recidivism? So we followed these folks, and we actually collected criminal record data for 5 years after their entry in that program. and found relationships to recidivism as well. Going back to the Venn diagram that Howard presented, that was the theoretical one. We created one from our data as well. And what we found is the gray circle is basically all substance-related disorders. So pretty much 100% of the population qualified lifetime for alcohol abuse or dependence or drug abuse or dependence. About 30% had conduct disorder or ADHD or intermittent explosive disorder. 20% with anxiety disorders, 12% with depressive disorders, 8% bipolar, and 1% who, through self-report on this instrument, would qualify for no disorders. What's more interesting is the overlap. So just like that theoretical picture, there's this overlap between disorders within our population. And when you look at that overlap specifically, in relation to the criminal record data, you see here on the red line are people who have psychiatric disorders beyond substance-related disorders, so anxiety or depression, and they have a much worse survival curve, meaning a greater percent of them recidivate than the other groups. So we're finding a definite link here between the psychiatric disorders and the recidivism tracked across time. Why does it matter? When we think about DUI programs, they could restructure to integrate information about that diagnostic status. So currently, even if only alcohol abuse or alcohol dependence are what's addressed in the program due to resources, if they know that 70% of their population has issues with ADHD, they might not want them all in class for 4 hours straight or 3 hours straight. There are ways to restructure even if there aren't the resources to specifically treat the disorders. As we move forward, if there are more resources and more awareness of these other disorders, you could incorporate, PTSD type programs and everything else. Knowing diagnostic status of offenders really allows you to determine how your program is doing for whom. So ways to tailor the program so it's more effective for people entering with different profiles. And very importantly, in kind of today's climate, at least in the way it works in Massachusetts, is knowing this diagnostic information allows you to plan aftercare. And so even if the DUI program itself doesn't have the resources, if it has referral resources to be able to refer these people out for additional treatment, knowing what type of treatment they need to be referring for is quite important. And finally, from a researcher's perspective, we can begin to link this diagnostic status even more specifically to recidivism and to reoffense. So why isn't it done? Howard talked about how we've known about this practically since 1985, 1986. Why don't we see more attention to these issues in DUI programs and elsewhere? The first point is awareness. I think that's been increasing. But there's also an issue of training and resources. So most counselors and staff in many DUI programs aren't trained to do full mental health assessments. And there certainly aren't the resources to devote more time than they're already devoting to all of the steps and paperwork they have to do related to the addiction problem. And finally, lack of immediate output. Even in the best programs, in Massachusetts, we had programs that were trying to address mental health disorders, but the counselor would have to come to their own assessment and then write up a full diagnostic assessment of what they thought was going on. So treatment providers really don't have the ready training and resources to accomplish this, and that's unlikely to change anytime soon in terms of resources. Now, what if you look at people who are trained? What if people do have the time and resources? The study on this slide was completed by looking at the medical records of 233 repeat DUI offenders who'd been through an alcohol treatment program. So they had access to what was written about all their issues. So we look at what the providers assessed, and then we compare it to what was assessed through a standardized mental health assessment. In this study, the providers estimated that about 1% of the population had bipolar disorder. According to the standardized assessment, it was 6%. They thought 10% would have qualified for depression. The assessment came up with 25%, 0 compared to about 3. And interestingly, the providers rated about 27% of their population as having a drug use disorder, and the assessment suggested it was only 11%. And I show this slide because a lot of times we see what we're looking for. So even if you have trained clinicians, trained counselors, without some sort of standardized, validated tool, different people are going to come to different assessments depending on what they're looking for. So, there's psychiatric comorbidity in DUI populations. These issues, more evidence is coming out that these are directly linked to recidivism. It's difficult to find this relationship because, as you know, DUI is going to happen 100 times before an arrest actually occurs. So it's low base rate disorder, and you find very few of the cases that are actually happening. Screening for mental health issues is rare within DUI treatment programs, and they rarely have the training or experience to identify them. So I think that's why the field has not moved since the 80s in that regard. So what we wanted to do in this project was start with the giant research tool we used for our project with the repeat DUI offenders and turn that into something that could be usable and user-friendly for programs to do themselves. So we developed the computerized assessment and referral system. We're implementing it at several DUI treatment programs, beginning in Massachusetts. And then really assessing the usability. And that is not a full-scale research trial. So that stage is more about really working with the people who are going to use this tool to develop something that works for them. So in the usability trial, we're saying play with this tool, give us feedback every week, tell us how to change it. And now we're at the point of making modifications based on that to then do a full randomized implementation trial with the new tool. And in that full trial, we will also be testing the tool's efficacy as sort of a brief intervention because it's our hypothesis that simply being asked these questions and simply having these issues raised and perhaps getting some referrals to treatment might help by driving more offenders to aftercare and treatment and to address these issues. So CARS is based on the CD. We actually have been working directly with Dr. Ron Kessler and his team, who were integral in developing the CD for the World Health Organization. We have cut it at least in half, if not more, and increased its flexibility in many ways. And then we've developed a diagnostic report generator. So before with the CD, it was a research tool, and if a counselor used it, they used it and then they never got any output. It went into a database. So the report generator we've created has immediate output. It's user-friendly. It describes the disorder in a way that's clear in language for people who are not clinicians. And then it has geographically and individually targeted referrals for the client based on their profile and based on where they live, including information about public transportation and how they can get to those sites. Before I go to the demo, because I'm going to demo the tool very briefly, but afterwards you're welcome to come and play with it more. When you first go into CARS, part of the flexibility is as a program, you can choose what modules you as a program want to use. So everybody has to go through the screener. And basically the screener will ask a couple questions each about each Axis 1 disorder according to the DSM. And based on your answers, it will screen you into other modules, and those will continue to screen and gate, so you only go as far as you need to. Then you can select for each additional module whether it's assessed. So it may be you don't have time to do the full CARS, but you know that there's a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder in your population. You can select that module, and you can choose whether you want to assess just for the past 12 months or lifetime. Again, it's a time trade-off on those issues. So CARS looks like this when you first open it up. It is currently self-contained on a single computer or on a program server, so it stays within their firewalls and within their information. Each staff member has their own login, but the administrator of the site can select for the site which modules are accessible. If I'm Joe Client and I go through the program and I use CARS, if I screen into 5 different modules, I may still only go into 2 if those are the only ones a program selects. So by selecting a module, you're selecting whether it's possible for a client to go into it. It doesn't mean they go into it if they don't screen into it, but it means it's accessible if they do. Once I go through this dashboard and I log in and I can either start a new session or continue a previous session. As an administrator, I can generate reports. And when I open it up, I'm going to start in the middle of a session here just so you can see. I have basically a set of screens that run me through questions. And in most cases, it's 1 question per screen. There are some grids, which you'll see that allow multiple questions per screen. There are interviewer instructions. So everything in black, people read verbatim. The interviewer instructions will give them information about how to enter answers. There will also be places where you can probe with additional text, and it lets you know that as well. So it's a very specifically guided interview process. On this side of the screen, you also have information that automatically pops up if it's needed for a question. For example, here you've got alcohol equivalents. You have a place to record notes to any question. Also, at the end of the interview, there's a chance to do interviewer observations, so you can indicate any observations you have about the interview itself. If I try to go forward without selecting a question, it will prompt me to answer that question. However, if a person refuses, there is the option to enter don't know or refused. We don't advertise that because it's better if you can get the answer first. And you continue to go through the instrument. When you have finished, even if you're not finished with the entire interview, let's say your client just has to leave, you can exit out of the instrument and come back to it at another date. So if you have weekly sessions with your client and it's run too long, you may pick up exactly where you left when they come back the next week if you'd like to. So when you exit, it asks you if you want to continue. If you say yes, it saves the session. If you say no, then it will just generate a report automatically based on the information that you have. I'm going to say yes for now. If I were to say no, it would think for a while, and it takes between 40 seconds and 3 minutes for it to generate a report. And the reason it can take up to 3 minutes is it's calculating all the diagnostic algorithms based on the questions answered. So I'm not going to make you wait for that. I'm going to show you what would come up after those minutes. You basically get a full PDF report. And this is always, we're always modifying and improving this as we go. This is the state it was in, I think, 2 weeks ago. You get a diagnostic case summary, a DUI-specific report, because we have a DUI-specific module in there that assesses DUI behaviors, criminal history related to DUI, risky driving behaviors, and other things we know are risk factors for DUI specifically. It tells you how far you got within the report. So this report is from someone who made it through every module that we had. It tells you for each disorder whether they met criteria, have subclinical symptoms, or screened into that disorder but were not tested, which would be the case if, as a program, you didn't have it selected. And this is useful because if I'm a program and I don't have PTSD selected, but I notice that 80% of my population is screening into that module, I might turn it on and decide that I do want to make the time to assess for that. And it gives, again, with the DUI report, there's specific information about drinking context and social network and criminal behavior. And then for each disorder that a person has, it gives a full, specific, detailed report on that disorder. So here's Joe Client qualified for bipolar 1. It gives a description of bipolar, and then it gives the diagnosis and a detailed information about Joe's symptoms, as well as onset and recency. And again, if you want to see more of this, don't worry about trying to read it now. You can come up after and look at it in more detail as well. Finally, you get a little risk indicator for DUI specifically. Our thought is that if this takes off and we begin to get a database, then we can actually make this more scientific. So the DUI risk would really, you would weight different factors differently depending on what we had found, et cetera. Currently, it's based on kind of the bulk of the literature. And then regional referral information that's targeted both to zip code and to, in this case, Joe client's specific profile. For one thing, Joe indicated in his screener that he was homeless. So we've got Boston Healthcare for the homeless, and we also have information again about public transportation for how to get there. And this is another database that we're continuing to update and add more specific information to as we go. Okay, so we developed this. And then we were at the point where before we went any further, we needed to throw it over the wall and see what DUI programs actually thought about it. So we had 5 agencies participate, constituting 9 sites within Massachusetts. And we asked both the counselors to participate and the clients who had gone through an interview to do a short survey. Each site was asked to participate for 12 weeks. Staff completed pre and post surveys as well as weekly surveys. And again, the clients completed short surveys. So first of all, pre-trial, before we implemented CARS, very diverse range of experience within these programs. So we've got 0 to 35 years of experience in kind of the field within DUI programs. Computer skills vary widely, at least within Massachusetts, within DUI programs, from needing help to turn the box on to being able to look at the programming code behind. In terms of time, before CARS, it varied widely in terms of how much time each counselor said they spent with their clients. Partly this is because we had both first offender programs and second offender aftercare programs and second offender inpatient programs. But most reported spending 1 to 2 hours conducting intakes, although 30% spent less than an hour conducting an intake. And more than 50% reported spending 1 to 3 hours on paperwork related to intake. So usually the paperwork took up more time than the intake itself. In terms of what they did before CARS for assessments, they confirmed that there was little focus on mental health issues. Not out of lack of desire, I would say, for the counselors. Again, it was really time and all the other paperwork that they had. Counselors reported that they would feel comfortable conducting a comprehensive substance use assessment, but on their own, they did not feel comfortable conducting a comprehensive mental health assessment. In terms of follow-up, more than 60% of the counselors reported having no follow-up with their clients after the program, and 15% had 3 months or less. And again, this was not the state that the counselors wanted to be in, but it was the state of things. And finally, more than 60% did indicate that they thought something like CARS could be useful to them. So was it? We had each of them each week report their experiences with CARS. Now, when we looked at most of the variables, we had a lot of fluctuation and no really significant trends. But we had a few where their ratings decreased over time. Part of these were good, part of these were not so good. If you look at what decreased over time, time needed to complete CARS, the impact on their workload, how complex they thought it was, and their technical difficulties all decreased. That's good. They got better with the tool got better. However, how much they reported liking CARS and how much they wanted to use CARS with their clients also decreased over time. So our interpretation on this, and after talking to them in depth, was that their efficiency increased, but they really started to experience some sort of burnout. So in addition to these surveys, we invited everybody to come to our offices at the division, and we did something called a group level assessment, where we really worked with the counselors to have them answer some of these questions, to brainstorm about what the issues were with CARS and how they might solve them. And what came out of that session was, first and foremost, their concern was the length of the tool. And again, that's within the programs with which they were working. They all said, ideally I would love to do a 2 or 3 hour assessment with my client. There is no way I can make that work. Positive feedback, they loved the reports and referral. Both provided more information than they would be able to generate themselves. And the referrals they found to be accurate and put them in touch with agencies they had not been in touch with before. One other concern that came up, in addition to just length, was that this might be too involved for a DUI program. So first of all, they thought the clients might need the treatment but not be open to it because they were there specifically for a substance-related issue. But more importantly, I think they were genuinely worried that there's no safety net for the clients once the issues are identified. So within a given program, you can say, okay, you've got issues with PTSD and generalized anxiety disorder and depression, here's the door. They didn't feel like simply giving the referrals was enough, and they didn't feel like they had the resources to follow up. The clients were asked specific questions, many of which mapped onto the questions that we asked counselors. So what did you think of the CARS interview? Most of these questions, the clients were kind of on the positive side, from it's okay to liked it a lot. So that's about 2/3 of the clients were generally positive. How valuable? Again, about 2/3 of the clients are finding it somewhat valuable to very valuable. And did you learn anything new about yourself? More than half reported that they had. What was interesting is I went back to the weekly surveys of the counselors and mapped them onto the clients for the program. And one of the questions asked the counselors whether they thought the clients liked the tool. And the clients' ratings were higher than the counselors on that variable. Positive. Clients found their counselor to be a key part of the CARS interview. They liked the way it allowed them to speak with their counselors. They liked the process of looking at the past and learning more about themselves. And again, they liked the detailed reports and referrals. Concerns, no surprise. Length of the assessment and the perceived redundancy or repetitiveness of it. Now, the redundancy and repetitiveness is deliberate in a way. So we ask some questions different ways to make sure that the answer is consistent. But it's also just a long interview if you select all of the modules. Some clients stated that there was nothing wrong with CARS, and those were the same clients who thought their counselors were the best part. So they really saw it as a chance to connect with their counselors. So finally this summer, in addition to finishing up our usability trials, we met with our advisory panel. So we have a CARS-specific advisory panel, and we went through a similar process with them of trying to get really detailed feedback about the tool and their thoughts for it. And their feedback fell into several areas. Scientific, really, we've developed this tool. What we need to do next in terms of the research is really identify whether specific disorders that we're identifying with this tool relate to recidivism in specific ways. And that's quite an undertaking, given, again, that identifying DUI recidivism can be quite difficult. But it's made us think more about additional outcomes we can collect during our implementation trial in terms of criminal record data, in terms of trying to obtain ignition interlock data and work with that population as well, so we can get really clear outcomes that relate to both using CARS, obtaining treatment after your second offender aftercare, and recidivism. Clinical. The advisory panel really suggested working with a range of DUI offender populations. We did this in the usability trial in terms of working with first offender programs and second offender programs. We're really interested in working with the courts as well and getting into the process even earlier so that this happens at, with probation officers and prior to that as well. Policy. Again, there's been a focus lately on DUI and DUI other intoxicants, so driving under the influence of drugs and things other than alcohol, and this fits well into that focus in terms of additional offender populations. And the advisory panel, again, just suggested continuing to raise this awareness about this issue. And finally, there's a lot of interest, as Ralph mentioned, in eventually using CARS in a variety of other settings beyond DUI programs. If this tool is successful, you could see it in a kiosk, at primary care, in emergency departments, college settings. There's a wide range of possible expansion opportunities. So based on that, the next steps that we're thinking about currently are threefold. First, we're thinking about an enhanced screener. This is really the modification that has come out of the feedback from the programs. And what I mean by that is currently, if you look at our screener, it's quite liberal. So if I say that in my lifetime, I've had a time period of several days where I was sad, empty, or depressed, I go into the depression module and it takes me a while to get out of there. If we add one or two questions within the screener and use the evidence from our previous samples to really look at what those key gates are and who goes on to receive a diagnosis and who doesn't, we could create a screener that's between 20 and 30 minutes long that could technically stand alone for those programs that really cannot find the time to do this. As scientists and addiction experts, our hope would be that programs could find the time to do a really full assessment, but when that is not possible, we want to have an option that's 20 to 30 minutes long that can stand alone. So that's what our current modification attempts are working on currently. An expanded implementation trial. So again, our original design for our trial has us looking at programs using CARS versus no CARS. So we find 2 sites, we randomize within the sites and have them use CARS with half their population. We follow up that whole population during that time and see if CARS has an impact on the treatment that happens after that, follow-up, as well as DUI recidivism. Because of this CARS screener idea, we'd also like to add a condition where we're looking at the screener compared to comprehensive CARS, both in terms of what diagnoses and risk areas we come up with, as well as in terms of that brief intervention trial. We've also talked about creating a self-administered version of this screener, again, thinking ahead to settings where you would want a client to potentially do the screener on their own, maybe in a waiting room, and then you could follow up later with the further comprehensive modules. And then this idea of really having enhanced outcomes. So this would take a longer follow-up because, at least in Massachusetts, this criminal record information doesn't really always catch up in terms of what you can access as a researcher for a year or 2. But really looking at that CORI data, and if we can get our hands on ignition interlock data as well, that would be quite interesting. And finally, Dr. Schaefer is going to talk about our ideas for a DUI treatment innovation center.
Thank you, Sarah. When we began this morning, I described the Division on Addiction and its mission when it was originally established at Harvard Medical School. For those of you that really paid attention to that, you could see that the mission statement was sweeping. Not only was it sweeping, I think from my early days at Harvard, I was taught by my colleagues and my senior faculty, think big. So we are thinking big. We're thinking about a DUI treatment innovation center now that we're developing some of the architecture that's necessary to do clinical outcome studies. We're also thinking big in a, well, I guess what I would call a Galilean way instead of an Aristotelian way. I don't want us to continue to think about separate silos, to think that mental health and substance abuse and the criminal justice system are all separate and distinct ways of dealing with deviant behavior. I mean, they are separate and distinct ways, but an integrated way is necessary, I think, and I think others think, the research shows, to deal with many of these problems. So we are proposing and shared yesterday with the Century Council our intent to establish a DUI treatment innovation center. And our goal is to develop targeted treatments for DUI, to do the assessments and integrate the psychiatric comorbidity into DUI treatment protocols. We want to evaluate these treatments so that we can establish best practices, as Sarah already mentioned, using randomized clinical trials, for example. We want to promote extramural research activities, not only here in the United States, but around the world. This is an issue that's affecting the entire world, and we do need to evaluate best practices. We need places that can train, collaborate, guide, learn from, teach to others about these kinds of matters. So we want to develop a visiting scholars program. We have noticed over the years that many people call us. We have hosted many people at Harvard, scholars from other places all around this country and around the world, as I said, to learn about these kinds of activities and then take that learning back and establish programs in their home communities. We also want to fund competitive research proposals. We'd like to establish satellite treatment programs. So we want to solicit competitive proposals from others that would like to serve as satellites to this treatment innovation center. And this will also provide us a richer opportunity to understand the problem in different settings with different treatment segments, different population segments for treatment, and giving us different training opportunities for clinicians, researchers, and policymakers so that we really can get serious about dealing with DUI. I don't think we're serious enough. I simply have come to the conclusion that we as a country are ambivalent about this particular issue for reasons I don't fully understand. It is a public health problem that places everyone at some risk. And it isn't about the alcohol, although alcohol is a part. It isn't about the mental health issues, although the mental health issues are a part. It's about an integrated whole and our willingness to take on this task. And from this task, I believe that we can advance our treatment and public policy issues that will deal with other aspects of deviant behavior. I mean, you have to start somewhere, and this is an important area to begin. I want to offer special thanks to our colleagues who work with Sarah and I and make it possible for us to do this kind of work and to be here on a day when we might be somewhere else in our offices. I also want to thank Dick Ashton and Ralph Hinkson, who are here from our advisory board. It's a pleasant surprise to see you here, and I appreciate you coming. Thanks for your contributions. There are many internet resources to connect with our work, both on this matter and other matters, and they're on the screen now. So there are resources. Some of you may have picked up publications related to DUI that we had available for this meeting, but there are others and others forthcoming. They're available in our library and archives at the division. There's also a weekly publication, The Basis. That's the Brief Addiction Science Information Source. That is the Boston Pops of science, if you will. It's to take science that might be a little bit too thick in other areas for a regular dose, and you can find short capsules, and of course DUI is part of that agenda, and it's free. You're welcome to subscribe or just download it yourself from the site. The Transparency Project, for those of you interested in data, is our repository for industry-funded research, so that there's a way for the raw data and the analytic data sets associated with research projects that we and others are involved in to become available to other scientists to speed up and magnify the process of doing research. Expressions of Addiction is a website dedicated to the stories of people who struggle with addiction so that you can learn about personal cases and see how recovery is possible. And then you have Sarah and my email address in case we don't get to talk and you have a question. I know questions often emerge when you're driving home from a meeting, so feel free to contact us. And then my children forced me into Twitter. So I do have a Twitter account, and generally that Twitter account is dedicated to information resources related to addictive behavior. So thank you all very much, and we're happy and we have time to take some questions before we go to the next part of this morning's agenda. So questions? I know you have questions.
I have a simple one, I think, and that is that Sure. I didn't see any places in your Venn diagrams or in your discussion about the genetic components that might underlie some of this.
There was, the next to the last circle that entered was other. Right. And it was a catch-all for all of these kinds of things. We know that genetic factors influence about 60% of addictive behaviors. We don't have a specific genetic load for a specific expression of addiction, but we know addiction is influenced by genetic factors, so that's something that we're certainly paying attention to.
And within the CARS tool, for each module, there is a question at the end of the module and a question in the screener about other relatives struggling with any of these disorders, and that comes up as a risk factor within the report.
Thank you. You had mentioned that the screener is based on DSM information, and I just wanted to know if you had any thoughts about the move from DSM-4 to DSM-5 and how that might affect the overall project. I see the nods. We're doing the same thing.
Yes. And as we develop the content, we basically have a question library. And in developing that, we have been, as we gain more knowledge throughout the project for those 3 years, we've been setting aside questions and tailoring them and talking to Dr. Kessler about the change to DSM-5. So we are poised to make that change as well.
I get the feeling you want to move on to the next part of the agenda. Ralph?
Well, just in closing, of course, I want to thank everybody for coming. This is a project that's been very important to us in terms of the council's perspective on looking for some innovation in terms of recognizing that these are really complex issues. And certainly from my humble background in education, realize that we need this kind of expertise and this kind of thinking to really look for some new ways of looking at a problem that continues to exist, no matter all of our efforts, whether it's from a policy standpoint or an enforcement standpoint or treatment standpoint, regardless of your perspective on it. So we're not there yet. This is a tool that continues to be tested. We still have another full year, 2014, where Drs. Schaefer and Dr. Nelson will continue to move along in terms of tweaking the tool itself, in terms of getting those trials out there so that we can really get the tool to a place where, again, its usability is to a level that this is not about it. This is not an academic exercise. We're certainly, those of you in the research field will see the value of the research, but for us, we're looking to make a contribution in the communities across our country that are affected by this, and see this increase in opportunity to look at DUI in a different way and to look at it in a more comprehensive way to be very, very important. At that point, as of course everybody knows in the definition of recidivism itself, this is really about not just developing the tool and getting it out, but looking at the tool going forward and looking at its impact and its efficacy as we go on. And the real measure of all this is again, not just how it's being used and what the client's reaction to it is, but 6 months later and 1 year later and 2 years later, and as this goes on. And so our commitment to this is to really see this through to a point where we're able to differentiate, if you will, the recidivism rate as a measure, perhaps not the only measure, but as a measure, an important measure, as far as we're concerned, of the impact of this kind of an assessment, and really the impact of a different holistic view of DUI and of the DUI offender. So for those of you here, if you're staying for the next roundtable session, there's a couple of minutes break while we deal with some of the technology issues. And for those of you who've joined us online, we appreciate your attendance. You've got Dr. Schaefer and Dr. Nelson's contact information. Certainly you can ask questions and email us or email them directly, and we're happy to continue to move the discussion along. So again, thank you very much.